So the other important role on the start boat is the sound signaller. Now they report to or have a very close conversation with the race officer and the timekeeper. They respond with sounds to the timer's countdown and coordinate with the flag person. And not uncommonly, the timekeeper and the sound person are the same person doing their one role, but sometimes we have the luxury of having a separate person to do this. They also respond with the sounds in coordination with the flags person if the race officer calls an individual or a general. So it's important to be familiar with the flags and the sounds required for particularly each of those calls. And obviously they are a very key and close part of that visual signal timekeeper sound signal team. They need to understand that there is a difference, different sounds for different flags going up and coming down. And obviously their key tool is some kind of sound making device. Often boats have some kind of a built-in horn that can be used, so they obviously need to know how that works on the boat. Also need a manual backup. Regardless, you need something in case the main system fails. The other key person that we talked about is the recorder, the person who's responsible essentially for the paperwork on the boat. Their main role is to compile, if you like, a diary or a log of things that occur during that race. They might be making a note of the competitors reporting at the start, so they're ticking off on the start list, the entry list. They're keeping a log of actions and communications that occur between the race officer or from the start boat to the other course boats. They're recording the information about what course was used, what the wind's doing, all of that sort of stuff is noted against the appropriate time. The key role they have though is to record the OCS boats or UFDs or BFDs, the boats that are early and whether or not they've returned. Recording the number of starters, which is predominantly a safety thing, and communicating that to or ensure that that's communicated to the other course boats. And essentially ensuring that the course board, which is telling the sailors what course they're sailing and what the direction to the first mark is on the board at or before the warning signal. Now a few things they need to remember is to keep some notes, to keep that log. They often are used to assist with the radio communication to the other boats. They can, the person that the race officer goes to about how many did we have starting on that fleet, or how many did we have that fleet, the recorder is the person that has all that information at their fingertips. And they need to keep an ear out for a radio call that indicates that a boat has either left the race course or being under tow or whatever. All that information should be recorded, so they really can't turn off in terms of listening to the radio. And obviously, you know, what they need is a paper and a pencil and something to write on, and ideally a list of the entries or the participants in that event so they can check them off. Now another role, and it may be the recorder that does that, or we may have the luxury of having a separate person do this, is to record the wind, particularly before the start. We're trying to establish what the average wind direction is and the strength. Why do we need to know that? We need to know where we're going to put that top mark because it's got to go upwind. And we need to know how long to make the course, because the wind strength will give us, the race officer, an indication of how long or how short they need to make that race course. So somebody has to record the wind. And what we do is essentially we use a compass, a couple of key tools, and we use something that will give us an indication of where the wind's coming from. Now we may have something a bit fancy like this, or it can be as basic as a bit of stick with a bit of string on it. Doesn't have to be flash, but you hold it up, the wind will blow it, and you'll be able to check the direction from which the wind is coming. And the idea is to record that at least every 5 minutes on a wind graph, and to keep a note of if there's any extremes in between. This then gives the race officer a really good indication of the range of the wind direction, and can start to think about where they're going to put that top mark. They also need to record the readings that are coming in from the other course boats. I mean, ideally all the other, or at least the top mark and some of the other course boats will be reading the wind as well for the race officer. And so all of that gets kept recorded on the one sheet. And when obviously the race officer is going to be saying, you know, what do you think, what's the average now? So they need to be, whoever's recording that wind direction needs to be able to respond to the race officer with, well, the average over the last little bit is whatever. So obviously as the race is going on though, you need to keep track of whether or not the wind is changing. And ideally any shift that's more than about 10 degrees, it's important that the race officer's aware of. And essentially throughout the whole course of the race, we keep track of the wind and the wind direction where we can, if we've got enough people. In an ideal world, we have plenty of people and we have one person dedicated to this task. So essentially, the tools that you need are a compass, some sort of wind indicator. To understand how strong the wind is, you might use an anemometer, something like this, which will give you an indication of, you know, how many knots we have. A chart, and obviously something to write with. So the other thing that could be a responsibility of a number of people on the boat, but someone needs, we need to ensure that this is done, is to display the course board. This has to be done at or before the warning signal, and it needs to have the correct information on it, the information about the wind direction to the first mark and which course they're sailing that particular race. And it's placed in a prominent position, often on the back or side of the start boat, so the sailors can actually see it. Now another job is literally monitoring the radio. Obviously the race officer has an ear out for it, but sometimes we have the luxury of having a separate radio operator on board the boat, and they're really key to the communication between the boats on the water and the boats on the shore. Obviously it's important to maintain a listening watch throughout the time we're on the water, and ensure that any changes in wind direction that are reported from mark boats are reported to a wind recorder or the race officer as soon as possible, as soon as they're received, particularly if a major change looks like it's occurring. They need to be aware of the communications between the mark boat operators, because then potentially you can preempt things that will need to be changed on the course. They communicate with the recorder to make sure that any important information is actually noted down. But even more important is the radio monitoring on shore, and that is really a key part in the whole safety plan for the regatta. So radio surveillance is maintained on all of the radio channels that are being used on the water, and we may use 2 or more people depending on how many channels we're using. It's imperative that a listening watch is maintained on all of the channels that are being used, and also the weather needs to be monitored. And so we're using tools like the bomb radar, the observations around the bay, the lightning tracker, all of those sorts of things, keeping an eye on to ensure that we can give information to the race officer about what's coming, if there needs to be some change made to what's going on the water. So it's important, if you have this role, to know the RQ radio procedures and make sure you've read it and understand the safety plan that goes with it. So depending on what frequency we're using on the race course, the call sign for RQ is either RQ72, RQ90 or RQ91. And obviously for those of you who've done the radio course, you'll know that the call sign from the water is this is Vic Frizzell, Goodwill, this is Vic Frizzell, or Mark 1, this is Start, or whatever. So we need to keep the conversations short, sharp, and to the point. We don't need a lot of chatter, because you can just imagine the poor person monitoring at the other end. And sometimes when people are busy, you might just hear a double click on the radio, and that means, yeah, got your message, not going to respond because I've got something else on, but yes, message understood. Now obviously if you have any interest in or any need to understand how to use a radio, there are some courses here at RQ, which are the Know Your Own Marine Radio course. Ideally, if you have a VHF license, that's a great prerequisite. But if you are monitoring the radio, and if you have any questions or you have any doubts at all, ask someone before you make a transmission so that you've got the correct information. You need to have a list of the key contacts both on the water and ashore handy, and keep a record of all the communications between the shore and the water, and there are log sheets that are used for that. So that essentially wraps up the session about the roles for race management on the water. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm going to record, that's right.
Yeah.
So is there one race officer per course? There's not
Yes.
one race officer per boat, is there? Just one.
One race officer per course, yes.
So the other boats are still needing to report to that one singular
Yeah.
race officer?
So there's one race officer per course, one race officer responsible for the course, and they make the decisions based on the information that they're getting from all the other boats on the course about what to do or what changes to make.